Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you relaxing and inspiring tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is The Endless Road, a heartfelt journey of rediscovery, resilience, and the beauty of chasing dreams, no matter your age. So settle in, get cozy, and let the story of George's transformative motorbike ride carry you to a world of adventure and possibility. Now, let's begin. The spark of the ride. George's fingers hovered over the glossy brochure, the words "Epic Motorcycle Tours of Europe" leaping off the page. For decades, he'd dreamed of riding a motorbike across the continent, but the years had a way of piling up, bringing along responsibilities, routines, and the creeping doubt that maybe he was too old for such a wild dream. At 55, the idea of kick-starting such an adventure felt both thrilling and absurd. He sighed, setting the brochure aside as he sank into his favorite armchair. His nephew, Sam, bounded into the room, his youthful energy filling the space. "What's with the long face, Uncle George?" Sam asked, plopping onto the sofa opposite him. George chuckled dryly. "Just a silly dream. I was thinking about riding a motorbike across Europe, but I think that ship has sailed." Sam's eyebrows shot up. "Are you kidding? Age is just a number. I mean, look at you. You're fit, you love riding, and you've got the experience. Why not?" George shrugged. "It's not just about the age. It's the logistics, the planning, the stamina." "Excuses," Sam interrupted with a grin. "Tell you what, I'll help with everything. Planning, packing, even getting the bike tuned up. All you need to do is say yes." George hesitated, the spark of adventure flickering in his chest. Could he really do it? The doubts were persistent, but Sam's unwavering confidence began to chip away at them. "All right," he said finally, a smile tugging at his lips. "Let's give it a shot." The weeks leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of preparation. Sam, true to his word, took charge of the logistics. He researched routes, booked accommodations, and even found a local mechanic to give George's classic touring motorbike a complete tune-up. The old bike gleamed like new by the time the work was done, its chrome accents catching the sunlight as George ran his hand over the polished fuel tank. "Looks like she's ready for the road," George said, a mix of excitement and nerves evident in his voice. Sam grinned. "And so are you." Packing was another adventure in itself. George carefully selected what to take: weatherproof gear, spare parts, a toolkit, a first aid kit, and enough clothes to last a week before needing to do laundry. Sam insisted on adding a GoPro camera to the mix, convinced they needed to document every twist and turn of the journey. The night before the trip, George barely slept. His mind buzzed with questions. What if the bike broke down? What if he couldn't keep up with the pace? But as dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, those doubts were replaced with a quiet determination. The journey was no longer just a dream. It was happening. On the morning of departure, the driveway hummed with anticipation. George donned his leather jacket and helmet, the weight of the gear grounding him in the moment. Sam stood by the bike, holding out a thermos of coffee and wearing a grin that could rival the sunrise. "This is it," Sam said, handing him the thermos. "The start of something epic." George took a sip of the coffee, savoring its warmth. He swung his leg over the bike and settled into the seat, the rumble of the engine beneath him like a heartbeat. With a final wave to Sam, he twisted the throttle and eased onto the road. The first few miles were a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. The bike felt heavier than he remembered, the balance requiring a concentration he hadn't exercised in years. But as the morning unfolded and the open road stretched before him, the rhythm of the ride began to settle into his bones. The countryside unfolded like a painting, rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep, fields of sunflowers swaying in the breeze, and quaint villages with cobblestone streets that seemed plucked from a storybook. George marveled at the sights, the wind tugging at his jacket as he leaned into each curve of the road. By midday, he stopped at a roadside diner perched on the edge of a valley. The aroma of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee greeted him as he stepped inside. Peeling off his gloves, the diner's walls were adorned with photographs of travelers who had passed through, their smiles captured against backdrops of mountains, rivers, and endless highways. "What'll it be?" the waitress asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Just a coffee and whatever's good," George replied, sliding into a booth by the window. Outside, the valley stretched endlessly, its greenery glowing under the midday sun. As he sipped his coffee, a man at the next table struck up a conversation. "Heading far?" he asked, nodding toward George's helmet on the table. "Across Europe," George said, the words feeling surreal as they left his lips. The man let out a low whistle. "That's quite the journey." "First time?" George nodded. "Something I've always wanted to do." "Well," the man said, raising his mug, "here's to chasing dreams." The afternoon ride was a revelation. The initial awkwardness of handling the bike melted away, replaced by a sense of freedom George hadn't felt in years. The roads became his companion, their twists and turns leading him deeper into a world that felt both vast and intimately connected. He passed vineyards where workers waved as he rode by, and forests where the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. By evening, George arrived at a small village nestled in a valley. Its narrow streets were lined with houses painted in soft pastels, their balconies adorned with flower boxes that spilled over with vibrant blooms. He found an inn at the edge of the square, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. The innkeeper, a woman with a warm smile, welcomed him as if he were an old friend. Dinner was a simple yet hearty affair, a bowl of stew accompanied by crusty bread and a glass of local wine. As George ate, the day's memories replayed in his mind. The wind on his face, the beauty of the landscapes, the kindness of strangers. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, connected to a dream that had once seemed out of reach. That night, as he lay in the inn's cozy bed, the bike parked safely below, George felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road ahead was long, but it was no longer daunting. It was an invitation, a promise of stories yet to be written. And as sleep claimed him, he dreamed not of destinations but of the endless possibilities of the journey. The first horizon. The morning came quietly, with soft rays of sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of George's room at the village inn. The air carried the faint scent of dew on cobblestones, mingled with the sweetness of blooming flowers in window boxes outside. As he stepped onto the balcony, a distant church bell chimed, its sound rolling gently across the valley. George took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the moment seep into his bones. This was the beginning, not just of the day, but of a journey he had dared to make his own. After a simple breakfast of fresh bread, butter, and jam made from local berries, George checked his motorbike. The machine gleamed in the sunlight, its polished chrome catching the day's promise. With his helmet secured and the bike's engine rumbling to life, George set off. The sound of the motor echoed through the narrow streets, fading as he left the village behind and entered the open road once again. The first leg of the day's ride led him through rolling fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. The landscape was painted in shades of green and gold, the wheat swaying gently in the wind, like waves in a sea of earth. George kept his pace steady, his senses absorbing every detail. The crisp wind against his face, the hum of the bike beneath him, the occasional burst of wildflowers lining the roadside. As he ascended a gentle hill, the horizon shifted, revealing a vista of winding roads disappearing into a distant forest. The trees stood tall and proud, their leaves shimmering in hues of emerald and jade. George pulled over to take it all in, the bike's engine falling silent as he removed his helmet. Standing there, he felt a profound connection to the world around him, a sense of belonging that made the road feel like home. The forest greeted him with a cool embrace, its canopy filtering the sunlight into a dappled mosaic on the ground. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, and George slowed his pace, savoring the tranquility. Birds flitted between the trees, their songs blending harmoniously with the gentle hum of the bike. He passed a stream that ran parallel to the road, its clear waters glinting like liquid glass. As midday approached, George found a clearing by the stream and decided to rest. He unpacked a small meal, cheese, bread, and a flask of tea, and sat on a fallen log. The sound of the water rushing over stones was a melody that seemed to wash away the weight of years spent dreaming but not doing. He scribbled a few lines in his notebook, capturing the moment in words that felt inadequate compared to the beauty before him. A voice broke the stillness, a fellow traveler who had parked their bike further down the trail. The man introduced himself as Lars, a rugged Swede who had been touring Europe for months. They exchanged stories over tea, their conversation punctuated by laughter and shared marvel at the wonders of the road. "You're never too old," Lars said, gesturing at George's motorbike. "The ride keeps you young, my friend." George nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I'm beginning to understand that." The afternoon ride was a sensory feast. The road twisted and turned through the forest, revealing hidden glades and ancient trees that seemed to whisper their secrets as he passed. Occasionally the path would rise, offering glimpses of the valley below, a patchwork of fields and villages framed by distant mountains. The rhythm of the ride was hypnotic, each curve drawing him deeper into the flow of the journey. By late afternoon, George emerged from the forest and found himself on a stretch of road that ran along the edge of a sprawling lake. The water was a deep, tranquil blue, its surface shimmering under the golden light of the setting sun. He stopped at a roadside cafe, its terrace offering an unobstructed view of the lake. The owner, an elderly woman with a kind smile, brought him a plate of freshly grilled fish and a bowl of fragrant vegetable stew. "You're lucky," she said, placing the meal before him. "The lake is at its most beautiful this time of year." George nodded, savoring the flavors of the meal as the lake reflected the shifting colors of the sky. He struck up a conversation with a couple at the next table. Retired teachers who had spent their lives exploring the world on two wheels. They shared their favorite routes and stories, their enthusiasm infectious. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of pink and orange, George felt a quiet joy settle over him. The road had brought him here to this moment, and it felt like exactly where he was meant to be. That evening, he checked into a modest guest house on the lake's edge. The room was simple but welcoming, with crisp white linens and a window that framed the starlit sky. George lay in bed, his muscles pleasantly sore from the day's ride. The steady lapping of water against the shore lulled him towards sleep, and as his eyes closed, he found himself thinking not of the miles he had covered, but of the ones that still awaited him. The journey was far from over, and for the first time in years, George felt truly alive, carried forward by the endless road. The open road beckons. The morning sun poured through the lace curtains of George's room, painting golden patterns on the wooden floor. He woke with the lingering scent of fresh bread and coffee wafting up from the inn's kitchen. The low hum of distant conversations from early risers added to the serene charm of the small village. George stretched leisurely, letting the previous day's miles settle into his muscles. Today was a new day, and the road awaited. Downstairs, the innkeeper greeted him with a hearty breakfast and a contagious cheer. "How was the bed, Mr. Adventurer?" she teased, setting down a plate of eggs, fresh tomatoes, and crusty bread. "Perfect," George replied, his voice sincere. "But I'm ready to see what's beyond the next hill." She laughed, pouring him another cup of coffee. "You've got the spirit for it. May the road treat you kindly." By mid-morning, George was back on his bike. The engine purred beneath him, its steady rhythm as familiar as a heartbeat. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of possibilities winding through the countryside. It was wider and smoother today, offering long, sweeping curves that allowed him to relax and take in the scenery. Fields of sunflowers and wheat rolled endlessly on either side, their colors vivid under the clear blue sky. Occasionally, a solitary farmhouse or a grazing horse appeared, adding character to the idyllic landscape. George found himself grinning, the wind tugging at his jacket as he accelerated slightly, leaning into each gentle bend in the road. The first stop of the day was an unexpected discovery, a small vineyard advertising tours and tastings. Intrigued, George pulled into the gravel lot and was greeted by a young man with an easy smile. "Passing through?" the man asked, glancing at the bike. "Something like that," George replied. Couldn't resist the sign. The vineyard tour was brief but delightful. Rows of grapevines stretched endlessly across the hills, their fruit ripening under the warm sun. The guide explained the intricacies of winemaking with a passion that reminded George of the joy found in dedicating oneself to a craft. At the tasting room, George sampled a glass of ruby red wine, its flavor rich and complex, a testament to the care taken in its creation. "You'll want to take a bottle," the guide suggested, handing him a wrapped package with a grin. George laughed. "Why not? There's always room for a good memory." The road transitioned into forested terrain by early afternoon. Tall pines lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the sunlight into shifting patterns. The coolness of the forest was a welcome relief from the midday heat, and George let himself relax into the ride, the bike's steady hum blending with the natural symphony of rustling leaves and bird calls. He stopped at a clearing where a picnic bench sat beside a gently bubbling brook. Removing his helmet, George let the fresh scent of pine and water fill his lungs. He unpacked a simple lunch, a sandwich, fruit, and a thermos of tea, and sat quietly, letting the moment seep into him. The brook's melodic flow seemed to wash away the noise of the world, leaving only peace in its place. As he ate, he spotted an older couple on matching motorbikes pulling into the clearing. They waved and joined him, their enthusiasm contagious. The couple, Anita and Martin, had been riding together for decades, their stories painting vivid pictures of adventures shared and lessons learned. "Every ride is a journey, but it's the people you meet along the way that make it unforgettable," Martin said, raising his water bottle in a toast. George nodded, feeling a kinship with them. They exchanged tips on routes and shared anecdotes, their laughter echoing through the trees. Before parting ways, Anita handed George a map, her finger tracing a scenic route she insisted he try. "You won't regret it," she promised. The afternoon brought that promised scenic route, and it was nothing short of spectacular. The road wound along a cliffside, offering breathtaking views of the coastline below. Waves crashed against jagged rocks, their white foam glinting in the sun. George slowed his pace, letting the grandeur of the scene wash over him. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had embarked on this journey, to feel alive, connected, and part of something vast and beautiful. The wind picked up as the road climbed higher, and George welcomed its exhilarating chill. He stopped at a lookout point where a wooden bench faced the horizon. Sitting there, he watched as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. A sense of quiet fulfillment filled him, as though the day had given him exactly what he needed, without him even knowing to ask. That evening, George arrived in a seaside town, its streets lively with the hum of activity. Lights twinkled from boats bobbing in the harbor, their reflections dancing on the water's surface. He checked into a quaint inn near the shore, the scent of salt and seaweed filling the air. Dinner was served on a terrace overlooking the water, a plate of freshly caught seafood, paired with the wine he had bought earlier. The taste was divine, each bite a celebration of the day's journey. As George ate, a street performer began to play a violin nearby, the hauntingly beautiful melody weaving itself into the evening air. After dinner, George took a stroll along the beach, his boots crunching softly against the sand. The stars above were brilliant, their light unspoiled by city glare. He paused to take it all in, the vastness of the ocean reflecting the endless possibilities of the road ahead. As he returned to the inn, his mind lingered on the faces and places he had encountered. Every mile traveled, every connection made, felt like a thread in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. He felt a deep gratitude for the adventure, for the freedom, and for the decision to chase a dream that had once seemed out of reach. In his room, George sank into bed, the sound of waves lulling him towards sleep. The journey was far from over, and that thought filled him not with exhaustion, but with an eager anticipation for the miles yet to come. The mountain calls. The morning dawned crisp and clear, with the faint scent of sea salt still lingering in the air. George stepped out of the inn, stretching as the sunlight warmed his face. Today, the road would take him inland, climbing steadily toward the mountains that loomed in the distance like guardians of the horizon. The promise of new vistas and challenges quickened his pulse as he geared up for the ride. The seaside town was just beginning to wake, its streets quiet save for the occasional clink of cups in a cafe or the soft chatter of fishermen preparing their boats. George mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life, its familiar hum like a trusted companion. With a nod to the town that had offered him such a peaceful night, he rolled out, the open road stretching invitingly ahead. The early part of the journey was gentle, the road weaving through fertile valleys dotted with orchards and vineyards. George passed workers harvesting ripe fruit, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The air was sweet with the scent of apples and grapes, and he couldn't resist pulling over at a roadside stall. An elderly woman selling freshly baked apple pastries greeted him with a warm smile. "Long ride ahead?" she asked, handing him a pastry wrapped in brown paper. George nodded, savoring the first bite. The pastry was flaky and fragrant, the apples inside perfectly spiced. "To the mountains," he said between bites. Her eyes sparkled with understanding. "They'll test you, but they'll also reward you," she replied. "Safe travels." Fueled by her kind words and the delicious treat, George continued, the valleys gradually giving way to foothills. The road began to climb, winding through dense forests where sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns. The air grew cooler, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp moss. The steady thrum of the bike blended harmoniously with the whisper of the trees. By midday, George reached a scenic overlook, the first clear view of the mountains he was approaching. He stopped, pulling off his helmet to take in the sight. Peaks dusted with snow rose sharply against the azure sky, their jagged edges softened by the distance. Below, a river snaked its way through a verdant valley, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. Another biker was parked nearby, his leather jacket emblazoned with patches from various countries. The man introduced himself as Marco, an Italian traveler who had spent years exploring Europe's most challenging routes. "You're heading into the heart of it now," Marco said, gesturing toward the mountains. "But the views up there, they're worth every ounce of effort." They shared a quick meal from their respective supplies, trading stories of the road. Marco's tales of alpine passes and hidden trails filled George with both anticipation and determination. Before parting ways, Marco offered a piece of advice. "Trust your instincts. The mountains demand respect, but they'll reward you if you listen." The climb began in earnest that afternoon. The road narrowed, its sharp twists and turns demanding George's full attention. The engine roared as he ascended, the bike responding smoothly to his every move. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool air, and his hands gripped the handlebars tightly as he navigated steep inclines and tight hairpin bends. But the effort was punctuated by moments of awe. A waterfall cascaded down a rocky cliff beside the road, its mist cooling George as he passed. Eagles soared above, their cries echoing against the mountainsides. Villages clung to the slopes like secrets, their stone houses adorned with vibrant flower boxes. George stopped in one such village late in the afternoon, the climb having tested both his endurance and his resolve. The village square was quiet, save for a fountain trickling softly in the center. A small inn offered refuge, its wooden sign creaking gently in the breeze. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a weathered face, greeted George warmly and ushered him inside. "You've earned a good rest," the man said, serving him a bowl of steaming soup and a slice of dark bread. "The mountains don't give their treasures easily." As George ate, the innkeeper shared stories of the region, tales of travelers who had braved the peaks, of legends whispered among the villagers. One story, in particular, stood out. A mythical pass, said to offer the most breathtaking views in all of Europe, but only to those willing to face its challenges. The room George retired to was modest but cozy, its wooden walls adorned with faded maps and photographs of the mountains in their many moods. He stood by the window for a long while, gazing at the peaks silhouetted against the twilight sky. The thought of the road ahead both exhilarated and intimidated him, but the day's journey had reinforced his belief in his own resilience. That night, George dreamed of winding paths and soaring vistas, of the roar of his engine mingling with the whisper of the wind. The mountains called to him, their rugged beauty promising both trials and triumphs. He awoke before dawn, a sense of purpose settling over him like the weight of his leather jacket. As he mounted his bike and set off into the cool morning air, George felt the pull of the road stronger than ever. The mountains awaited, their secrets and splendor ready to unfold for those brave enough to seek them. And with every twist of the throttle, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Echoes of the peaks. The morning was sharp and clear, the air cool enough to nip at George's face despite the protective layer of his jacket. The mountains loomed ever closer, their peaks brushed with the light of the rising sun. George had risen early, the promise of adventure pulling him out of bed and onto the road before the village even stirred. The engine's growl reverberated through the narrow streets as George left the village behind. The road climbed higher, carving through cliffs that dropped steeply into valleys far below. Each twist and turn demanded precision, and George leaned into the challenge, the thrill of the ride coursing through him like a second heartbeat. As the morning stretched on, George entered a stretch of road known locally as the Ribbon, a serpentine path that hugged the mountainside and offered unparalleled views. He stopped at a lookout point where a wooden railing stood between travelers and the vast expanse below. The valley sprawled out endlessly, dotted with emerald forests, shimmering lakes, and quaint villages that seemed to cling to the edges of the earth. George removed his helmet, letting the cool mountain breeze tussle his hair. He wasn't alone for long. A group of riders pulled in, their bikes gleaming under the sun. They greeted him warmly, their camaraderie immediate. "You look like someone who appreciates the road," said one, a tall man with a thick accent and a laugh that echoed across the peaks. His name was Klaus, and he was leading a group of friends on a similar journey. They shared stories, Klaus and his group animatedly recounting their favorite routes and misadventures. One of the riders, a woman named Lena, handed George a thermos of coffee, its warmth seeping into his fingers as he listened. The conversations were rich and unhurried, the kind that felt like they could only happen in a place so removed from the rush of everyday life. As the group prepared to leave, Klaus suggested George follow them for a while. "The next stretch is something special," he promised with a grin. "You'll want to see this." Curious and trusting his newfound companions, George fell into line behind their roaring engines. The road ahead wound through alpine meadows, their wildflowers painting the landscape in bursts of color. Snow-capped peaks framed the horizon, their majesty growing with every mile. True to Klaus's word, the route soon revealed its treasure, a hidden plateau where a crystal-clear lake reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. The group pulled over, their bikes forming a neat row as they took in the scene. The air was thinner here, each breath filled with the crispness of high altitudes and the faint scent of pine. Klaus clapped George on the shoulder. "Not bad, eh?" "Not bad at all," George replied, his voice tinged with awe. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for this moment, for the road that had brought him here, and for the people who had shared the journey, even briefly. The group parted ways shortly after noon, each rider heading toward their own adventure. George continued his ascent, the road becoming rougher and steeper. The engine's steady growl was his constant companion, a reminder of the partnership between man and machine. By mid-afternoon, the climb peaked at a mountain pass, its summit marked by a simple wooden sign listing the elevation. George stopped, the wind tugging insistently at his jacket as he stood at the edge of the world. Below, the valleys stretched endlessly, their contours softened by distance. Above, the peaks seemed close enough to touch, their icy crowns gleaming under the bright sun. George sat on a boulder, letting the stillness envelop him. He unpacked a small meal from his saddlebag, a sandwich, a bar of chocolate, and a flask of water. Each bite tasted more vivid here, the altitude and the effort sharpening his senses. He jotted a few lines in his notebook, his words a pale reflection of the grandeur before him. The descent was exhilarating, the bike cutting smoothly through hairpin turns as the road spiraled downward. The landscape shifted rapidly, the stark beauty of the peaks giving way to rolling hills and dense forests. George passed through tiny hamlets where children waved enthusiastically and the scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys. By evening, he reached a bustling mountain town nestled in a valley. The streets were alive with music and laughter, a festival in full swing. Lanterns hung from every tree, their warm light casting a magical glow over the cobblestone streets. George parked his bike near the town square, drawn by the festive atmosphere. He wandered through the stalls, sampling local delicacies, savory pastries, spiced sausages, and mulled wine that warmed him from within. The townsfolk welcomed him like an old friend, their joy infectious. He found himself laughing, dancing to the lively music, and sharing stories with strangers who felt like kindred spirits. Late that night, George found a small inn on the edge of town. The room was simple, its wooden beams dark with age, but the bed was warm and inviting. As he lay there, the memories of the day swirled in his mind: the ribbon, the lake, the festival. Each moment felt like a thread in the tapestry of his journey, weaving together a story richer than he had ever imagined. Sleep came easily, the rhythmic sound of the town's music fading into the distance. The road ahead was still long, but tonight George felt deeply content. He was exactly where he needed to be. Valleys of connection. George awoke to the soft rustling of leaves outside his window. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in golden light. The echoes of last night's festival still lingered in his mind, a symphony of laughter, music, and warm conversations that had filled his heart. But as he laced up his boots and prepared to hit the road, the mountains and valleys beyond the town beckoned him with promises of new discoveries. He stepped outside to find the town slowly stirring to life. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air as shopkeepers opened their doors and children chased each other across the cobblestones. George mounted his bike, the rumble of the engine turning heads and earning him waves from the townsfolk. He returned their gestures with a smile and a nod, feeling a sense of belonging even in this transient part of his journey. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of opportunity, leading George through a sprawling valley, flanked by gentle hills and dense forests. The crisp morning air carried the earthy scent of dew-soaked grass, and the distant sound of a river winding its way through the landscape added a soothing rhythm to the ride. As he entered the heart of the valley, the landscape opened up into a patchwork of farms and meadows. Golden fields of wheat swayed in the breeze, and vibrant sunflowers turned their faces toward the sun. George couldn't resist pulling over to admire the view. He parked his bike near a wooden fence, resting his arms on the weathered rails as he took in the scene. Nearby, a farmer and his wife were tending to a herd of goats. Spotting George, the farmer waved and walked over, his broad smile as welcoming as the valley itself. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice warm and accented. George nodded. "Couldn't help but stop. This place is incredible." The farmer chuckled. "It's home, but it's always nice to see it through fresh eyes." He introduced himself as Emil and invited George to share a cup of coffee under the shade of a large oak tree. The coffee was strong and fragrant, served in simple ceramic cups. Emil's wife, Marta, joined them, bringing slices of freshly baked bread spread with creamy goat cheese. The three of them talked easily, the conversation flowing like old friends reconnecting. George shared stories of his journey so far, and Emil and Marta spoke of the valley's history and their life on the farm. "Travel changes you," Emil said thoughtfully, watching the sunlight dance on the fields. "It makes you see things differently, even your own backyard." George nodded, feeling the truth of the words settle within him. Before he left, Emil handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For the road," he said simply, his smile needing no explanation. The day unfolded like a carefully written story, each mile bringing a new chapter. The road curved gently through the valley, flanked by towering poplar trees that whispered in the breeze. George passed through tiny villages, their stone cottages adorned with brightly colored shutters and flower boxes bursting with blooms. At one such village, he stopped at a small cafe perched beside a sparkling river. The terrace was shaded by grapevines, their leaves creating a natural canopy. George ordered a light lunch of fresh salad, crusty bread, and a glass of chilled wine. As he ate, The sound of the river mingled with the laughter of other patrons, creating an ambiance of simple contentment. A young woman sitting nearby noticed George's notebook resting on the table. "You're a writer?" she asked, her curiosity genuine. "Not exactly," George replied with a smile. "More of a traveler jotting down memories." She nodded, introducing herself as Sophia, a painter searching for inspiration in the countryside. Their conversation drifted effortlessly from art to travel to the shared wonder of seeing the world anew. Before leaving, Sophia handed George a small sketch she had made of the riverbank. "A little piece of this moment," she said. The afternoon took George deeper into the valley, where the road began to climb again, revealing sweeping vistas at every turn. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the hills in warmth, and George felt as though he were riding through a living painting. The bike's engine purred steadily, its rhythm syncing with the beating of his heart. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, George arrived at a hillside inn tucked away among the trees. The building was charming, its stone walls softened by ivy and its windows glowing with inviting light. The innkeeper, an elderly man named Klaus, welcomed George with a firm handshake and a knowing smile. "You've been on the road a while," Klaus observed, his tone more statement than question. "Come, let's get you settled." The evening was spent on the inn's terrace, where Klaus served a hearty meal of roasted vegetables, tender lamb, and buttery potatoes. A small group of other travelers joined the table, their laughter and stories filling the night air. George found himself listening more than speaking, captivated by tales of distant lands and shared adventures. Later, as George retired to his room, the sounds of the valley at night, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves, lulled him into a peaceful state. He stood by the window for a while, looking out at the moonlit hills and reflecting on the day. The connections he had made, however brief, felt like threads weaving him into the fabric of the world. Sleep came easily, carrying George into dreams of endless roads and boundless horizons. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces, and new stories, and as always, the road would be waiting, ready to lead him onward. Riding through history. The morning mist clung to the valleys, curling around the trees and softening the edges of the landscape. George stepped out of the hillside inn, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he stretched, taking in the crisp mountain air. Klaus, the innkeeper, waved from the doorway, holding out a thermos of coffee. "A little warmth for the road," he said with a smile. George accepted it gratefully, sipping the rich brew as he admired the view. The hills rolled endlessly before him, shrouded in a silver haze that hinted at the day's promise. The road called to him, as it always did, and he soon found himself astride his motorbike, the engine rumbling beneath him like a heartbeat. The descent into the valley was a slow and scenic affair. The road wound through dense forests, where the sunlight pierced through the mist in golden beams, casting ethereal patterns on the ground. The air was alive with the scent of pine and damp earth, and George couldn't help but smile as he leaned into each curve, the rhythm of the ride grounding him in the moment. By mid-morning, the forest gave way to open fields and small villages, their stone buildings weathered with age but full of character. George stopped at a roadside bakery, drawn by the aroma of fresh bread. Inside, an elderly woman greeted him with a warm smile, her hands dusted with flour. "Traveling far?" she asked as she handed him a loaf of dark rye. "Far enough," George replied with a grin. He bought a small packet of local cheese and found a shady spot under a tree to enjoy his impromptu picnic. The bread was hearty, the cheese sharp and creamy, and the combination was perfect. As he ate, he watched villagers go about their day. Children playing, farmers tending to their fields, and a man repairing the wheel of an old cart. There was a timeless quality to the scene, a sense that life here moved at a pace untouched by the rush of modernity. The road took George into a region rich with history. Signs along the way pointed to ancient castles, centuries-old monasteries, and battlefields where the echoes of the past still lingered. He decided to take a detour to visit one of the castles perched high on a rocky outcrop, its towers visible from miles away. The climb to the castle was steep, the road narrowing as it twisted up the hill. George parked his bike near the entrance and climbed the final stretch on foot, the stone path worn smooth by countless visitors over the years. At the top, he was greeted by sweeping views of the surrounding countryside. Fields stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional river or patch of forest. Inside the castle, George joined a small tour led by a passionate historian who brought the place to life with tales of knights, sieges, and the daily lives of those who had called the fortress home. George found himself captivated, his imagination filling in the gaps as he wandered through the grand halls and narrow corridors. In the castle's courtyard, a group of musicians dressed in period costumes played hauntingly beautiful melodies on lutes and violins. George lingered, letting the music transport him to another time. He jotted down a few notes in his notebook, his words attempting to capture the magic of the moment. The afternoon ride was a study in contrasts. Leaving the medieval castle behind, George followed the road into a bustling town where modernity had firmly taken root. Cars zipped past him, and sleek buildings lined the streets. He stopped at a cafe with outdoor seating, where he ordered a strong espresso and watched the ebb and flow of city life. While the town lacked the charm of the countryside, it had its own energy, a vibrant pulse that George found intriguing. He struck up a conversation with a man at the next table, a software engineer on a short holiday. They talked about the differences between city and rural life, their conversation punctuated by the clinking of cups and the hum of traffic. "I envy you," the man said, gesturing toward George's bike. "Being able to just pick a direction and go." George smiled. "It's never too late to find your own road." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, George left the city behind, his bike carrying him back into the embrace of nature. The road climbed again, this time through rolling hills covered in vineyards. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the land in warmth, and George could hear the distant laughter of workers harvesting grapes. He stopped at a small vineyard, where the owner, an elderly man with a weathered face, welcomed him with a glass of wine and a plate of olives and cheese. They sat on a terrace overlooking the rows of vines, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Every grape tells a story," the man said, his voice soft and reflective, much like every mile of the road. George nodded, savoring the wine's rich flavor and the quiet wisdom of his host. The moment felt timeless, a perfect encapsulation of the journey's essence. That night, George stayed at a family-run inn in a small village nestled in the hills. The room was cozy, its wooden beams dark with age, and its walls adorned with framed photographs of the region. As he lay in bed, the events of the day played through his mind: the medieval castle, the bustling town, the peaceful vineyard. The journey was teaching him something new with every mile, every encounter. It wasn't just about the destinations, it was about the people, the stories, and the simple beauty of being present in the moment. Sleep claimed him as the moon rose high above the hills, its silver light spilling through the window. The road awaited him in the morning, its mysteries and magic ready to unfold. The whisper of the wind. The morning arrived with a pale mist blanketing the hills, weaving between the vineyards and small cottages like a living thing. George woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the faint murmur of early risers beginning their day. He dressed quickly, eager to feel the road under his tires once more. The innkeeper's daughter handed him a basket of fresh pastries as he left, her shy smile a reminder of the warmth he had encountered on this journey. "Safe travels," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you," George replied, his gratitude genuine as he strapped the basket to his bike. The engine's growl echoed through the quiet village as George set off, the mist clinging to the winding road. The world felt subdued, as though it was still waking up, and George welcomed the tranquility. The ride began gently, the road dipping and curving through the hills with a rhythm that matched his steady breathing. The pastries proved a delightful mid-morning treat when he stopped at a clearing overlooking a valley bathed in golden light as the mist burned away. The landscape changed as George rode further north. Rolling hills gave way to flatlands where fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The roads here were straight and smooth, bordered by canals that mirrored the sky's shifting hues. It was a different kind of beauty, less dramatic, but no less captivating. George passed windmills standing proudly against the blue sky, their blades turning lazily in the breeze. He stopped at one, its ancient wooden frame a stark contrast to the gleaming steel of his motorbike. A tour was offered, and George decided to indulge his curiosity. Inside, the air smelled of wood and oil, and the guide explained the windmill's intricate workings with a passion that made George admire the ingenuity of its design. "It's been standing for over 2 centuries, the guide said, patting a sturdy beam, a reminder that even in stillness, there is purpose. Those words stayed with George as he continued his journey. The wind that had turned those blades for generations now tugged at his jacket, pushing him forward like an unseen companion. By midday, George reached a small town built along the edge of a sprawling lake. The streets were narrow and cobblestoned, lined with houses painted in cheerful pastels. Boats bobbed gently in the harbor, their masts swaying in time with the lapping water. George parked his bike and wandered through the town, drawn by the scent of fresh fish frying in open-air markets. He bought a plate of fish and chips from a vendor and found a seat by the harbor. The meal was simple but satisfying. The crisp fish and salty fries complemented by the cool breeze coming off the lake. As he ate, an elderly man joined him on the bench, his weathered face kind and curious. "Passing through?" the man asked. George nodded, sharing a bit of his story. The man listened intently, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of nostalgia and admiration. "I used to ride," he said wistfully. "Not as far as you, but enough to feel free." "What stopped you?" George asked gently. "Life," the man replied with a shrug, though there was no bitterness in his tone. "But listening to you, maybe it's not too late to start again." George smiled, moved by the man's sincerity. "It never is." The afternoon ride took George around the lake, the road hugging its edge so closely that the water seemed to reach for him at times. Swans glided across the surface, their reflections shimmering in the late afternoon sun. George found himself slowing down, not because of fatigue, but because he wanted to savor every moment. The road eventually led him to a forest on the lake's northern edge. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, and George felt a profound sense of peace as he rode deeper into the woods. He stopped at a small clearing where a wooden bench overlooked a stream. Sitting there, helmet in hand, George let the stillness envelop him. The stream's gentle babble was the only sound, its melody a soothing counterpoint to the hum of the bike that had carried him here. As evening approached, George emerged from the forest and into another small village. This one was quieter than the last, its streets almost empty save for a few children playing near a fountain. He found an inn with a thatched roof and ivy climbing its stone walls. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a booming laugh, welcomed him like family. "You must be starving," she said, ushering him to a table near the fireplace. Dinner was a feast of roasted chicken, buttery potatoes, and a medley of fresh vegetables. George ate heartily, the day's ride leaving him with an appetite that matched the warmth of the meal. The innkeeper joined him for a while, sharing tales of her travels in her youth and asking about his journey. "It's a gift, you know," she said as she refilled his glass of wine. "To see the world with open eyes and an open heart. Not everyone gets the chance, or takes it." George nodded, her words resonating deeply. The road had given him more than sights and sounds. It had given him moments like this, connections that reminded him of the beauty of human kindness. That night, George lay in a room lit only by the soft glow of the moon, filtering through the curtains. The wind whispered against the windows, carrying with it the promise of another day on the road. As he drifted to sleep, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the journey itself, but for the courage to take the first step. The road ahead was long, but George welcomed it. He had learned to listen to its whispers, to trust its turns, and to embrace its lessons. Tomorrow would bring new faces, new landscapes, and new stories, and he was ready for all of it. The horizon expands. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains of George's room, casting a soft glow over the rustic wooden furniture. The wind from the previous night had settled, leaving the air outside crisp and still. George took a moment to breathe it in, standing at the window as the village slowly stirred to life. There was a quiet magic to mornings like this, a feeling that the day held endless possibilities. After a hearty breakfast of fresh eggs, dark rye bread, and coffee brewed strong enough to shake off the last remnants of sleep, George prepared for the day's ride. The innkeeper bid him farewell with a firm handshake and a warm smile, her words ringing with sincerity. "Ride well, and remember, it's the journey, not the destination." George mounted his motorbike, its engine growling to life as he pulled onto the empty road. The wind brushed against his face like an old friend, and the open horizon seemed to beckon him forward. The morning ride was a symphony of sensations. The road wove through rolling farmland, where the golden hues of harvested wheat fields stretched endlessly, broken only by clusters of trees and occasional farmhouses. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with cottony clouds that seemed to drift lazily in time with George's thoughts. He passed through small villages, where children waved enthusiastically from the roadside, their laughter carrying on the breeze. At one stop, a young boy approached shyly, his eyes wide with curiosity about the bike. George knelt down, answering the boy's eager questions and letting him touch the handlebars. "You're like a knight on a steel horse," the boy said, his awe unmistakable. George chuckled, the boy's words sparking a deep sense of satisfaction. "Maybe I am, in my own way." By mid-morning, the road began to climb into a range of low hills, their slopes dotted with vibrant wildflowers that swayed in the wind. George stopped at a scenic overlook, where a wooden bench faced a valley bathed in sunlight. He removed his helmet and sat for a while, letting the beauty of the moment seep into his soul. An older couple hiking along the same trail soon joined him, their walking sticks clicking softly against the stones. They introduced themselves as Ruth and Victor, retired teachers traveling through the countryside. The three of them struck up an easy conversation, sharing stories of their journeys and the lessons they'd learned along the way. "You're never too old to explore," Ruth said, her eyes twinkling with conviction. "The world has a way of surprising you when you're open to it." George nodded, her words resonating deeply. He had found this to be true time and time again on the road, each turn bringing new landscapes, new faces, and new opportunities for connection. The afternoon brought George to a bustling town nestled along the banks of a wide river. The town's cobblestone streets were alive with activity, merchants selling colorful wares, musicians playing cheerful tunes, and the smell of roasting chestnuts wafting through the air. George parked his bike near the market square and wandered on foot, soaking in the vibrant energy. He bought a skewer of grilled vegetables from a street vendor and found a seat near the riverbank. The water flowed steadily, its surface sparkling like liquid silver under the sun. As George ate, he found himself struck by the town's rhythm, a harmony of tradition and modernity where the past seemed to dance hand in hand with the present. A young artist sat nearby, her easel propped against a tree as she sketched the river scene. She caught George's gaze and smiled, gesturing for him to come closer. "You have the look of someone with stories," she said. George laughed, intrigued by her perceptiveness. "I suppose I've gathered a few." They spent an hour talking, the artist asking questions about his travels and sharing her thoughts on capturing fleeting moments in her work. Before parting, she handed George a small drawing, a quick but striking sketch of his motorbike against the backdrop of the river. "A little piece of today to carry with you," she said. The road out of town followed the river's winding path, leading George through dense forests where the sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, and the hum of the bike blended harmoniously with the whispers of the wind. As evening approached, George reached a remote lakeside village surrounded by towering cliffs. The village was quiet, its streets lit by lanterns that cast a warm glow on the stone walls. He found an inn, perched at the edge of the lake, its terrace offering an unobstructed view of the water. Dinner was served outdoors, the table set with local delicacies, grilled fish, roasted potatoes, and a salad of fresh greens, drizzled with a tangy vinaigrette. The innkeeper, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, joined George for a while, sharing stories of the lake's legends and the travelers who had passed through over the years. As they talked, the moon rose over the cliffs, its light reflecting off the lake's surface like a silver mirror. George felt an overwhelming sense of peace, the kind that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. Later that night, George stood at the edge of the lake, the cool water lapping at his boots. The stars above were a tapestry of light, their brilliance undiminished by the quiet darkness of the village. He thought about the road he had traveled, the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, and the ways it had changed him. The journey felt infinite, its impact stretching far beyond the miles he had covered. And though he knew this chapter would soon end, the road would always be there, waiting for him to return. As he drifted off to sleep in his room, the sound of the lake's gentle waves lulling him into rest, George dreamed of new horizons, vast and uncharted, filled with the promise of discovery. The journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Homeward roads, new horizons. The morning mist hovered over the lake like a delicate veil, the stillness broken only by the soft ripples of water where a lone swan glided gracefully. George stood at the edge of the terrace, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, and took in the serene beauty of the scene. It was his final morning on this leg of the journey, and the weight of the road behind him settled gently, like a cherished memory. The innkeeper appeared beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of his woolen jacket. "Heading home?" he asked, his voice low and warm. George nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "At least for now." The innkeeper's gaze drifted over the lake. "A traveler like you never really stops. The road has a way of calling you back." George chuckled softly, knowing the man was right. It does. But home is its own kind of adventure. The ride back was both familiar and new, the road unfurling with a sense of closure, yet brimming with the promise of future journeys. George traced his way through the landscapes he had come to know intimately over the past weeks. The golden valleys, the whispering forests, the vibrant towns and quiet villages. Each curve of the road felt like a farewell and a thank you. He stopped at places that had marked pivotal moments of his journey. The vineyard, where the owner had shared his wine and wisdom, the scenic overlook where he'd met Klaus and his group of riders, the lakeside bench where he had shared a quiet conversation with a stranger. Each stop felt like revisiting an old friend, and George found himself lingering, letting the memories wash over him. As the sun began its slow descent, George reached the outskirts of his hometown. The familiar streets welcomed him like an old friend, their details softened by the golden light of evening. He could see the smoke curling from chimneys, the faint hum of life carrying on as it always had. Yet to George, it all felt different now, more vibrant, more meaningful, as though his journey had sharpened his perception of the everyday. Sam was waiting for him in the driveway, his face splitting into a wide grin as George rolled to a stop. "You did it," he shouted, running up to hug his uncle. "I can't believe it. How was it?" George laughed, pulling off his helmet. "Better than I could have imagined." They spent the evening in the warmth of the kitchen, George recounting stories from the road over plates of hearty stew. Sam listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting with questions or exclamations of disbelief. "And the best part?" Sam asked as the night grew late. George paused, his gaze distant but warm. "The people, every single one of them, their kindness, their stories, they reminded me why the world is worth exploring." That night, as George lay in his own bed, the comfort of home wrapping around him, his thoughts wandered back to the road. He felt no sadness in having reached the end of this journey. Instead, he felt a quiet anticipation building within him, a longing to hear the growl of the engine and feel the wind on his face once more. The next morning, George found himself in the garage, wiping down his bike and checking its tires. Sam walked in, raising an eyebrow. "Already planning your next trip?" "Something like that," George said with a grin. "I met a few people along the way, like-minded riders who talked about the Trans-Siberian Trail. We're thinking of giving it a go." Sam's jaw dropped. "The Trans-Siberian? That's huge. Does Aunt Liz know?" George laughed. "Not yet, but I'll convince her. Maybe she'll even join me for part of it." Sam shook his head in amazement. "You're unstoppable, Uncle George." George smiled, feeling the truth of the words resonate in his chest. He had thought this journey was about proving something to himself, that he wasn't too old, that dreams didn't have expiration dates. But the road had given him something far greater, a reminder that life was not about reaching a single destination, but embracing the endless possibilities of each new horizon. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, George wheeled his bike out of the garage, its chrome gleaming in the light. The road stretched before him, infinite and full of promise. With a quick glance back at Sam, who was grinning ear to ear, George started the engine. The roar of the motor filled the air, and George felt the thrill of the journey surge through him once more. The road called, and he was ready to answer. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey, The Endless Road. If George's story of rediscovery and resilience inspired you, consider giving us a thumbs up. Share this tale with friends and family who might need a reminder that dreams know no age. And don't forget to subscribe to Story Planet for more relaxing and inspiring adventures every day. Wishing you peace, inspiration, and a restful night. Sweet dreams.